Hey guys, and welcome to Bible 365. I am your host, Kathy Carter, and the point and purpose of this podcast is to draw you closer to the Lord by reading your Bible. And so the way in which we're doing that is through a Bible reading plan from One Year Bible Online. It's the chronological Bible reading plan. So instead of reading it from cover to cover, just reading books straight through, we are reading it in a historical order, which will make more sense of the entire story from start to finish. And hopefully you're going to start to see, and hopefully by now you have, start to see connections of the Bible together. I am trained in nothing except I read my Bible. I've been doing this every year for, I don't know, I think the past 5 years. And so this year I just wanted to share it with people because I think it is something that we can all do. So one of the reasons I share that I have no skill or background is because the Bible is meant for all of us. And it is written in a language in which we can understand. So it is translated from a language that most of us don't understand into something that we can understand. So we can take it, we can grab it, we can read it, and we can strengthen our faith through the reading of God's word. And then through all of that, we can be a light in the world. So people are drawn to that light. So then they are also drawn to our God. And this is the God that made everything. It made the world, it made the entire solar system, it made the universe, this God, and God obviously made us. And so I want us to understand ourselves better, understand the Lord better, and then kind of grow from there. We're only here for a very short time. And this is what the book that we're reading today says. We're here for a very short period of time. What are you doing with the time in which you have been given on this earth? So all of that being said, today is, so we'll go daily, obviously, through the Bible reading. So I read it every day. Today is 160, and it is June 8th, and today we are looking at a couple of different books. We are finishing up the book of Ecclesiastes. We're going back into 1 Kings, so 1 Kings 12, and then we're doing 2 Chronicles 10 and 11. And so we go back, we're going into the life of Solomon's son, but we're finishing up with the book of Ecclesiastes. The book of Ecclesiastes is, for those of you who have not been with me before today, this is the very end. So I always say I recommend to go back because I think it just helps with context. But if you're just with me and you're just trying to figure out what's going on here, the book of Ecclesiastes is written by likely King Solomon. And he likely wrote this probably closer to the end of his life because he's lived and experienced a whole bunch of things. And he's sharing with the church. So ecclesia is the church. Ecclesiastes is sort of a form of this. And it's somebody who has called the church sort of to a gathering in order to share all this information with them. It's essentially a book of wisdom. Although if you were with me yesterday, you know I'm struggling to find sort of the loop, the key in this. I have a little bit, but it's definitely been, there are some tough passages. There are some tough things in there. So I just want to get started in that section. I want to kind of finish this Ecclesiastes up, and then we will move on from there. So we're finishing Ecclesiastes and starting in verse 11:7. So he's come from the place. We've done 10 chapters up to this point, and starting in chapter 11. And it's a lot of like, depending on your version, he says things like it's meaningless or it's vanity or right, like all of these things, like sort of in a way it doesn't matter. And I think the reader can be left with the idea that nothing matters. And I don't think that that is what he's saying to us. So imagine, if you will, so this is kind of part of what I like to do in my own envisioning when I read it, and I'm trying to help and guide whoever's listening through that. Imagine, if you will, not that you are who you are today and you're reading this for the first time and trying to figure out the meaning, but imagine you are the original audience. So imagine that Solomon is your king and he is the leader of your people, and the Lord has left the world for you in such an area where there is great prosperity. There's no war, safety on all sides. People are coming to listen to your king in droves because he's so wise. And so you are living in this world, and you're probably doing pretty well for yourself. And so you're listening to all the things that he has to say. So what is our king saying to us? Right? So like, I'm just kind of like average Joe Schmo. I'm coming to this temple, and you are speaking to me as this wise being. And so I just want to listen and hear what you have to say. So what am I going to gather from that? And then he kind of stands up on stage and he goes, everything is nothing. But you are, as this Israelite person, you are a believer that Solomon is a follower of the Lord. Solomon was given his position by the Lord, and he follows the Lord's commands and decrees. Now, at some point, he starts to turn, right? So we got a couple of chapters back, and Solomon starts to turn a little bit, and the Lord is like, you're being super wicked. He turns not necessarily away from God. He still honors and represents God, but he turns towards other gods. And to the point where he actually worships, he makes asherims and high places for sacrifices and all of these things because his wives were following all those gods. So he's been led astray by his wives, and he's starting to find and follow into other things. At this same time, he is at the head of the courts, and so he is answering to all of these people who come to him and say, so and so stole, John stole my cow, and it was my cow, and it was the only cow I had, and I can't believe John stole my cow. Can you fix this situation? Right? So like, he's also dealing with people who fight over things, who desire to follow folly, right? Things that aren't good for them, that God says is a huge no-no. And so he's watching his people do this. And so he's just gleaning all of this information. He's like, in some ways, like a computer, just sucking everything in. And then he comes to the end and he basically says, I've done all this. So now I'm speaking to you, and I've done all this. I've seen all this. I've lived in a lot of these ways. And I'm telling you, it is all meaningless. Don't try to be the wisest person in the world. Don't try to be the person that lives a life of folly. Don't toil so much that you can't enjoy life, right? Because all of that is meaningless. All of this, like, living for something is meaningless. So, and I may have shared this already, but I get into this place where I'm like, I share the word with people. The Lord calls me to share even this, like I'm doing this. I put this out, and I share with people. I talk to people. People come up sometimes and ask me questions that aren't believers. And usually it doesn't really come to much. So it's not like people run to me a week later and go, oh my gosh, I've seen the light and now I believe, right? Do I base my relationship in this earth on that? Do I base my relationship with God on that? Because doing that is meaningless. That is folly if I base it on any particular situation in this world. But he's also giving a ton of wisdom to tell us the way that we should be going. So how can you reconcile those two, right? Like, why should I do this if it's meaningless? So in my heart, I have some struggles with it, but intellectually, I understand where he's coming from. Intellectually, he's saying God is the only thing that matters. So let's move on to the actual scripture. So here he comes. It's following up with, so we started at chapter 11. Chapter 11 was a little bit yesterday, so I kind of want to dive into that before I move on to this stuff down here. He says, ship your grain across the sea. And then it says, so he's telling us all these things to do. And then he's following up, like, if the clouds are full of water, they pour rain on the earth, right? Like, these things happen. This is just part of life. So your seed in the morning and at evening, do not let your hands be idle. So in one sense, he's saying eat, drink, and be merry. And then this other sense, he's saying work in the morning and work at night, because we kind of don't know which way everything's going to work. And then he comes down into 11:7. So this is where we start today. Light is sweet, and it pleases the eyes to see the sun. However many years anyone may live, let them enjoy them all. So now we're kind of coming back to like enjoying your life, but also remember the days of darkness, because there's going to be many, and then everything is meaningless. So enjoy the light, remember the dark, everything is meaningless. It says, you who are young, be happy while you're young. So I'm going to follow this up where it says in verse 12:1, remember your creator in the days of your youth. So yes, enjoy your young while you're young, because some of it goes on to say a little bit later what happens kind of when we get older, and how you are when you're young. So enjoy your youth when you're young, right? There's a reason. And I'm living by this now, because I'm coming up essentially to the second half of my life. I'm probably in the second half of my life, but if all things are great and I live till 100, I'm coming up to the second half of my life, and I'm recognizing I need glasses now. I never needed glasses before, right? Like, did I enjoy my perfect vision when I was young? Right? Like, so things are changing. Life changes. It's harder to get up in the morning. I'm more tired. My bones hurt. Right? Like, so there's all these like normal things that happens with age. So to be real about enjoying life when you're young, enjoying what youth has to offer you, right? And taking the blessing of that, because that isn't always there. So one of the things that he says, and this is kind of one that like threw me for a loop, and he says, so it's this same section. It starts in verse 9. You who are young, be happy while you're young, and let your heart give you joy in the days of your youth. This is one of those areas next they're coming to that we're like, Jesus says not to do this. Okay, so follow the ways of your heart and whatever your eyes see. But know that for all these things, God will bring you into judgment. So then banish anxiety from your heart and cast off the troubles of your body, for youth and vigor are meaningless. So this is now another where like, okay, so I was thinking, because so one of the verses says, God will bring you into judgment. For me, when I read this, it doesn't say bad judgment. It doesn't say follow your heart and then all kind of bad things are going to happen when you judge it. God's going to judge you and it's all going to be bad. He doesn't actually say that. So he just says judgment, and God judges good or bad, right? God is the one who chooses what happens actually during our entire lives, and then also what happens after our physical lives on the earth are over. So God makes that judgment. He separates the wheat from the tares, right? We're talking about New Testament stuff, wheat from the tares. He has a chosen people, and if they follow his decrees, then there's life, and if they don't follow decrees, then there's death. And so there's all of those things that he makes judgments on. And then for those who follow his decrees, but then they do things. So if like we go to David, right? So David followed his decrees. David was a man after his own heart. Actually, we should probably go to Solomon, but going to David, when David royally messed up with Bathsheba and Uriah, there was punishment on earth, right? The baby that Bathsheba was carrying died. And that was because of the wickedness that he had. And so when he did this other thing where he took a census, there was another a punishment on earth here for him. When Solomon turned away from, turned towards other gods, right? And started making high places for these other gods, the punishment was that his son was not going to hold on to the kingdom. So, right. So God's making judgments, and he's saying, when you follow me, when you say you're a follower of me, and then you don't do the things that I ask you to do, then there's going to be a payment for that. If you are not a follower of me, then there's a payment for that as well. If I opened your eyes and then you chose another route, there's a payment for that, right? So there's I shouldn't say payment, there's judgments, right? So he makes judgments, good or bad, he makes judgments, because when it's good, he makes judgments as well. And then there's blessings that come from that, right? When you follow his rules and decrees. So I don't think here he's talking about that it's an immediately bad judgment. Follow your heart, bad judgment. I think what he's saying is, because again, when it says remember your creator, right? So turning your heart towards your creator, right? And then following that, turning your heart towards your creator, remember your creator, know who your creator is, turn your heart towards your creator. And then when your heart is turned towards your creator, be anxious about nothing, right? Then it says, cast off all the troubles of your body, banish anxiety from your heart, right? And follow your heart. So, but these are when you remember your creator. Again, this is the way that I'm seeing it, this is the way in which I view it when I read it a few times and try and read it in context. And this is what I see with an overall picture of what Solomon is trying to give. All right. So moving on from there, he starts talking about youth. So, and I don't want to go into this, but verse 3, it says, when the keepers of the house tremble and the strong men stoop, right? So he's talking about like, this is what getting old kind of looks like. The people are afraid of heights. There's dangers in the streets, right? All of these things. And then it goes back to remember him before the silver cord is severed and the golden bowl is broken. And then before the pitcher is shattered at the spring. And I'm thinking this is before death, right? Remember him, and the dust returns to the ground it came from, and the spirit returns to the God who gave it. Remember him. Do not forget the Lord in all of your things, right? So remember the Lord, and then whatever decisions come from remembering the Lord. And this kind of goes back to, like, I don't know, weeks, maybe months ago, that's this whole idea of right and wrong. Remember the Lord, make your decision on that, and then surrender all of that to the Lord and be free of it, right? Because holding on to all those other things, that's meaningless. That's pointless. All right, so now I'm thinking that we're changing authors. We're coming to his concluding thoughts. And it says in verse 9, not only was the teacher wise, I don't think Solomon's talking about himself. I feel like there's somebody that followed up after. Again, just an opinion. Not only was the teacher wise, but he also imparted knowledge to the people. He pondered and searched out and set in order many proverbs. So I think this is someone talking about Solomon. Verse 11, it says, the words of the wise are like goads, collected sayings, firmly embedded nails. So these are things that are strong and that we need to note and be aware of. We need to really remember all these things. And I know there were some literal things where it says, write these on your foreheads, remember these in your heart. And it's figurative speech about how this should be cementing itself inside our very natures, so we follow the decrees of the Lord. Verse 13, now all has been heard. Here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments. That's it. That's like he's finishing his whole book. Everything is meaningless, but in conclusion, fear God and keep his commandments. Verse 14, for God will bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it is good or evil. So these are important things. Again, this is why I come back to it's wisdom literature. And I think I believe it's noted as such, but to remember that wisdom comes from the fear of the Lord, which is what it says in the book of Proverbs. And to be wise, we need to adhere to the fear of the Lord, his decrees, the people that spoke wisdom, and then remembering that all of these things that we try and do in our own making, or the things that we want to do without the Lord, all of that is just meaningless. I believe that's what the book is concluding. I think that's what makes sense. Anyway, we're moving on from there. So we're going back to Kings. So I hope that helped a little bit in the book of Ecclesiastes, if you guys were struggling with it in the same way in which I was. Okay. So this is a follow-up. So we kind of went in the middle because it's the book of Solomon, and now Solomon has died, and now his son is becoming king. And so if you guys remember, there was a judgment made by one of the prophets of the Lord, and he said that 10 tribes were going to go to Jeroboam, and then 1 tribe was going to go to Rehoboam, who was Solomon's son. Jeroboam was not Solomon's son. Rehoboam was Solomon's son. I know the names probably get a little messy. All right, so if we go to this verse, it says, Rehoboam went to, and I just want to note that a lot of this is duplicated in Kings and Chronicles. So there's a lot of duplication. So I might not point out a huge amount of verses. But starting here in verse 1, Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all Israel had gone there to make him king. So Rehoboam, Solomon's son, he goes to Shechem because he's thinking everyone's going to make him king. When Jeroboam heard, the one that was told that he was going to take 10 tribes, when Jeroboam heard, he came out of Egypt. So they sent for him, and the whole assembly of Israel went to Rehoboam. So here we go. Jeroboam is in Egypt. He kind of fled from Solomon. Rehoboam is going to get crowned king, is what he's hoping. Everyone goes to Jeroboam and is like, hey, Rehoboam is going to be crowned king. So Jeroboam kind of brings everybody, and they go to Rehoboam and they say, your father has put an unfair yoke around us. He's worked us too hard, and we want to be your servants, but we need you to ease up some of these restrictions. So Rehoboam goes to his elders. He says, go away for 3 days and then come back. And he goes to his elder board. There, if you guys remember, there was always a series of elders at the temple. This was older men who were like heads of tribes and all of these kind of things. They were like essentially already in charge of a lot of things. And so they had wisdom, and then they would come together and then they would talk about where they think the kingdom should be. Because again, I remember, and I've said this many, many, many times, and I really think this is important, that both government in the Israelite tribe and their faith was all intertwined, right? It was all one thing. So it wasn't separated. Like you have a congressman that does this, but you have your church elder that does that. It wasn't like how we are now. Israel was all unified. It was all together. So he went to his elder board and he was essentially like, hey, this is what Jeroboam presented to me. What are your thoughts? And this is what they say. And I want to be exact with what they say. They reply, if today you will be a servant to these people and serve them and give them a favorable answer, they will always be your servants. So I want to be clear that the idea of a servant king has essentially always existed, right? So he says, if you, or these elders say, if you be a servant to them, so if you humble yourself and you serve them, they will always serve you. I'm going to say this is wise counsel, right? And that's the point of having them on there, that this was wise counsel. He decides he's going to go to his friends. So he's like, okay, I hear you. Gotcha. He goes to his friends that he grew up with, and he asks them the same question. And so they have quite a different answer. So let's say they answer this. Now tell them, my little finger is thicker than my father's waist. Kind of the expression being like, I'm bigger than he was. My father laid on you a heavy yoke. I'll make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I'll scourge you with scorpions. This was the advice that he got from his friends. This is why, so being literal in some aspects, and I'm kind of passionate about this. This is why life experience is really, really important. You grow in wisdom. And I'm sure someone's going to say, well, Solomon was a young king. Yes, that is true. But what's the first thing he asked for? He asked for wisdom from the Lord. He already had wisdom. So to ask for wisdom, it showed that he already had wisdom. That's unusual, right? Like, so if I talk to my children, I have lived 28 more years than my oldest child. I have more life experience. In general, not always, in general, I'm going to have more wisdom. This is why it's wise to reach out to people that are older than you and that have lived a life that you haven't quite developed yet, right? Instead, he hears them and then he decides maybe he doesn't like that answer. And so he goes to his friends, and his friends offer him pride. So the elders offered servanthood. His friends offered pride. Listen to your father's books, right? The book of Proverbs is all about negating the idea of pride. So you come to these people with pride, and let's see what happens. If you read it, you already know. So he goes, and that's what he says to Jeroboam. Like, hey, listen, I'm going to make it worse for you. And so now what God said was going to happen happens, because Rehoboam is a fool and he acts foolish. And so he takes wisdom from people that aren't wise, and he uses his pride, and he creates a situation in which they don't want to follow him anymore. And so then it says in verse 16, it says, when all Israel saw that the king refused to listen, they answered the king with, what share do we have with David? So now they're like, we're done with you. And then so they all decide that they're going to leave. And then the king sends out his servant to go out there, the guy who has been in charge of all the forced labor, and they kill him. And then he finds a sneaky way to go out and hide and go run away. And when he goes to run away, then he is now leader over one tribe, which is Judah. However, they also say that he's the leader of Benjamin. So he gets Judah and Benjamin together. And then one of the things that he decides he wants to do is he wants to go to war. So he's, which I guess would make sense, because he believes that the kingdom is supposed to be his. And so he kind of brings everybody together to go to war. But God, because this is what God does. So he goes, so it says down in 1 Kings 12:21, it says, when Rehoboam arrives in Israel, he mustered all of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin, 180,000 able young men to go to war against Israel. And then it follows up, it says, but this word of God came to Shemaiah, the man of God. Say to Rehoboam, son of Solomon, king of Judah, to all Judah and Benjamin, and to the rest of the people, this is what the Lord says, do not go up and fight against your brothers, the Israelites. Go home, because this is my doing. So God comes now and speaks to them and says, don't do it. Don't fight your brothers. Go home and take rest. And they do. So luckily they do that. Then things start to break, I feel like, even more. So now they're a split kingdom, right? So Rehoboam has Judah and Benjamin. Jeroboam has all the other 10 tribes. Because the temple is in Judah, right, with Rehoboam, Jeroboam is like, well, if they go down to Judah to go worship the Lord down there, to go offer sacrifices and everything, they're going to turn from me and they're going to turn towards him. And I can't have that. So what he does is he makes 2 golden calves. And so he says, now these are your gods and you're going to sacrifice to them. And like, I want to be like, what are you thinking? But maintaining power, like the truth matters is God gave him this kingdom. Right. And God said to him, remember, so God gave him this kingdom and he said, if you follow all my decrees and everything, I'm going to give you a dynasty forever. And right, like immediately, it feels like Saul. Immediately he turns and he says, I'm going to do this my way because I don't want people leaving me. So his desire for power and control over these people is bigger and more important than allowing God to do what God's going to do. God gave him the kingdom. He was a nobody and God gave him this kingdom. And he decides to hold on to it by turning away from God and by making his own calves. And so, obviously, I feel like we see the danger in this. And then it says, so if we follow up in First Chronicles, Rehoboam lived in Jerusalem and built up towns for defense in Judah. So he builds up all these towns, and then all these people worship the Lord under him. The priests and the Levites from all their districts throughout Israel sided with him. And they side with him because one of the things that Jeroboam did is not only did he make calves, but he randomly picked priests. So it was no longer the Levites that took sacrifices. It was kind of like whoever he decided wanted to take sacrifices. This was not the way of the Lord. The Lord did not approve of him to do this. So they left and they decided that they were going to be with Rehoboam. So now Rehoboam, Solomon's son, is in control of Judah, Benjamin, and the tribe of the Levites. And so that's where it ends today. And I feel like kind of it's this big explosion about everything, I shouldn't say explosion, maybe implosion. The kingdom is sort of broken up into pieces. And now we're going to see what ensues after this. So if you have found this to be a blessing, I'm done for today. So if you've found this to be a blessing, I want you to like it, share it, subscribe to the channel so you can continue, or so you can go backwards. If today was your first day, you can go back and go back to the beginning, go back to Genesis so you can build your foundation, because there's so much amazing information in here about the way God works through his people. So I want to thank you for that. And in the meantime, guys, I want you to keep reading, and I will see you tomorrow.